Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live, Seasonal Affective Disorder. I'm Lindsay Whistle-Fenton. In a given year, about 5% of the U.S. population experiences seasonal depression, and the number of those affected is higher in regions that experience harsher winter weather. Tonight, our guests discuss what leads to seasonal affective disorder and methods for treating it. We'll also discuss ways to stay healthy and active during the winter months, and we'll take your questions. Now, let's meet our guests. Dr. Michelle Newman is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Penn State's College of Liberal Arts. Her research focuses on the nature and treatment of anxiety and mood disorders. Dr. Natalie Hernandez de Palma is a psychologist and assistant director of clinical services at Penn State's Counseling and Psychological Services, or CAPS, where the mission is to address the psychological needs and personal concerns of Penn State students. Sharon McDonald is a food safety and quality educator with Penn State Extension. Her experience includes home and consumer food safety and nutrition. Thanks all so much for being with us tonight. You can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet your question or comment using the hashtag WPSUconversations. So I think to begin, I want to talk about just defining what seasonal affective disorder is, because I think there's a lot of misinformation where people write it off as the winter blues, or I hear people say things like, oh, well, everyone gets a little down when the days are shorter. So let's start a conversation about what is seasonal affective disorder. So Michelle, do you want to take that?
Sure. So it looks very similar to major depressive disorder. You can experience any of a variety of the symptoms of major depressive disorder. The most common associated with sort of fall and winter symptoms are oversleeping and overeating, in addition to sadness and lethargy. And in the summertime, oftentimes people feel more anxious and aroused and have difficulty sleeping more.
And that is something I want to talk about later, about the different ways the different seasons affect it. But Natalie, is there anything that might help people distinguish from when they are just feeling kind of down? And again, we all, I think, get a little bit of a downer when the winter weather starts and we want to stay inside. But what kind of takes it to that level of where you might have a more serious issue?
Sure. I think when your mood is so low that it impacts things like work, not being able to enjoy the things that you typically enjoy, when it's really impacting you on a daily basis, because about 95% of the population will experience some difference in mood or difference in physiology when the seasons change. But taking it to that level that Michelle was speaking of for sort of major depressive disorder, we're really looking at a significant decrease in mood, productivity, activity, and again, not finding things as sort of fun or pleasurable as you used to.
And Sharon, I think that in the winter, people probably experience challenges anyway with their diet and maybe their exercise routine. So what are some of the things that people tend to get into in the winter nutrition-wise that maybe aren't the healthiest habits?
Well, I think sometimes in the winter, when we're kind of cooped up, can't get outside, people turn to what we call comfort foods, those foods that tend to be higher in calories, higher in fat, warmer foods that we like to eat. And because people aren't getting outside as much, the major activity is maybe snacking or cooking or eating those higher calorie foods.
And in turn, what can those higher calorie foods do to your brain chemistry and ultimately your mood? I would think there's some kind of an impact.
Do you want that one?
A lot of things can affect brain chemistry. I think people think about chemical things as being the only things that affect brain chemistry, but the way that you think can affect your brain chemistry, so your general outlook on life can affect it, your activity levels can affect it, as well as, different foods that you would eat.
And in terms of, we talked about some of the symptoms of what people might watch for, but are there any things that people might be suffering from if they're experiencing seasonal affective disorder that they might not immediately think of as, maybe I'm just overtired or I feel a little sluggish? Are there kind of hidden signs that people can be on the watch for?
If it's starting to interfere with your functioning, then that means it's at a clinical level usually.
I think like a combination of some of the symptoms we've talked about, sometimes coupled with like negative cognition specifically about the seasons changing. So sometimes there will be sort of like a conditioned effect where maybe year after year when you turn that calendar over and you see, oh, this is where daylight savings times ends, you immediately think, oh, this is just going to be terrible. That we're starting sort of the worst time of the year for me. Those are good signs that you might be impacted by seasonal affective disorder.
And how should people know when, I would think especially with something like seasonal affective disorder, there might be a tendency to think, well, I just have to tough it out. It's just going to be a bumpy few months, but I just need to, hunker down and I'll get through it. And then they start to feel better maybe when we do get some longer days. But is it likely to be something that they will continue to struggle with if they haven't sought treatment?
Most likely, yes. And treatments differ. Some of them require sort of ongoing use, like light therapy, but other treatments, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, tend to be more sustaining.
Do you have anything to add, Natalie?
I think that's just a good sort of point to bring up around like toughing it out, because I think when we talk about sort of some of the negative cognitions, those negative ways of thinking that can accompany seasonal affective disorder or depression, it can almost be another negative thought on top of what's already a negative thought to say, oh, it's my fault, I need to just kind of work harder. Those things can just sort of compound the negativity. So we actually want to help people come up with more helpful sort of adaptive thoughts.
And we will talk about treatment, but first we have an email. Jim writes, what is light therapy? Is this something I can do at home? Which is a great question.
Yeah, you can definitely do it at home. You can buy light boxes that, you can just Google it. And you're typically, you use them first thing in the morning when you get up for about half an hour, you sit in front of it.
And when we say light box, it's literally like a box with a very bright light?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
That mimics sunlight.
Is this something that an insurance company would be likely to cover if it is considered a treatment?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. Do you?
I think it's something that, and I forget the word for it, but I think it's something where if you have the sort of account through your health insurance company where you're allowed to defray some of your income into sort of a health account, that you could use that for something like this. I'm not positive that every insurance company would reimburse for it, though, even though it is an approved treatment for seasonal affective disorder.
So that raises an interesting question with the do it at home. I think there's the idea of you can do this treatment at home, but is it advisable if someone is suffering from some of the symptoms that you said to just think, well, I'll just get a light box and try that and maybe forego actually going in to see a mental health care provider?
Studies have generally shown that it's equally effective to other types of treatment during the acute phases of seasonal affective disorder. The problem is that you would have to continue to use it. It wouldn't ever prevent recurrence, and you could expect that it would be it would be an ongoing thing. That's the advantage of other treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, which would also involve changing thoughts as well as increasing activity levels. And once you sort of change your habits of kind of giving in to depression and sitting around rather than being active, which is one of the things that can help treat it, it's more sustaining and more preventative.
Do you have anything to add, Natalie?
I think the only thing that I'll add is that while light therapy is a great treatment, it can be hard to sort of sustain something like that on your own without doing maybe some other sort of talk therapy where a therapist is helping you sort of know how to use those things effectively and then keep using it. Because often, like other forms of treatment, once you start to feel a little better, it can be easy to stop doing it. And like Michelle's saying, it's really important to keep using it.
To kind of demystify what that might look like, I think if someone's never been to a mental health care provider before, it can be really intimidating to make that first call and go to that first appointment. So can you talk a little bit about what someone could expect in a first appointment if they just call up and say, hey, I think I might be suffering from this, what should I do? And they come in to see a counselor.
I think what people can typically expect is some paperwork, gathering some background information. Paperwork is absolute. Gathering background information and then really talking a little bit about what sort of things are bothering you. So the same way you might go to a medical doctor and they might say, where does it hurt? Sort of a therapist will use those same techniques to say what's going on for you internally. Tell me about your emotional world. Tell me about your thinking world. Tell me about how you're behaving and how those things are impacting your life. And then really helping you figure out what you might need to do next to start on the path toward wellness, toward where you want to be.
Great. We do have another email. Carol writes, what is melatonin's role with SAD? Should I be taking melatonin supplements if I'm having trouble sleeping? So I think that raises good questions too about some of the causes aside from just, it's cold out and I don't want to go outside. So what are some of the causes, and then getting into the melatonin supplements?
So melatonin is thought to play a role in the etiology of seasonal affective disorder. We actually don't know what causes it exactly. I mean, we know that it's related to restriction or higher or lower sunlight, but other than that, it's unclear. There are a lot of biochemicals that can change during different times, and there are a lot of things, like I said earlier, that can affect different biochemicals. There are suggested melatonin treatments. It's not clear that they're effective.
I think if we think about seasonal affective disorder as having something to do with your circadian rhythms being off, though, and that delayed dawn really impacting sort of how alert and awake you can feel in the morning, then you can imagine if you feel fatigued all day, you might be, likely to have your sleep be off that evening. So I can see why some people would think if I can just take the melatonin and get a good night's sleep, I can sort of start over. I think light therapy sort of impacts the beginning of the day, though. We would say we want to sort of simulate dawn, or we want to simulate that sort of bright morning light that we get so nicely in the summer. And that actually, I think, has that positive impact on nighttime sleeping, because you're a little bit more alert earlier in the day and you might have a fuller day or more energized day.
And I'll just add that there's a tendency to want to oversleep, so it's also important to get up earlier than you want to.
Yeah, I think
and
that's
regularly.
It's always challenging. I know in my house you get up and the floors are pretty cold, and that bed is just so nice and warm. That can be difficult. So in addition to the light box, you talked a little bit about some of what the cognitive behavioral therapy might look like. What might a treatment look like with kind of all those pieces working together? And is there a role for supplements or nutrition, or for even medication if it's needed?
So cognitive behavioral therapy is a skills-based therapy. So the idea is that a lot of the mental health disorders that we experience are due to kind of bad habits that we might get into. And so you learn and you have to practice specific skills that we know can change anxiety and depression, for example. So it could be a combination of things such as activity levels, so scheduling activities to make sure you're active, including exercise. Exercise is a great thing. In addition to actually doing something called cognitive restructuring, where you look at the way that you're thinking and interpreting events around you and challenging whether you're actually using evidence or you're just saying overly negative things to yourself.
Do you have anything to add to the treatment?
I think that, with cognitive behavioral therapy, using things like a light box can be very helpful. Those things can, I think, work nicely in concert with each other. I think that antidepressants have been proven to be pretty effective as well. So a lot of the studies that are out there will compare different treatments, and they'll say, oh, light therapy is sort of just as effective as antidepressants. And so I sort of encourage people to meet with a treatment provider and really investigate all the different options, because one of them might feel more like a fit for them.
I think that's interesting to talk about fit when you're talking about treatment, because I would think that seeing a counselor or mental health professional is just like any other relationship that you're developing, where that fit with the person is so important. So I feel like there might be a tendency, maybe if somebody goes in for an initial appointment and maybe they don't feel like they're clicking, should they, should they just kind of give up and say this isn't going to work for me, or is there freedom for a patient to explore multiple options for treatment?
There definitely is freedom. And so cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, is a type of treatment that involves a certain amount of commitment. You're asked to do homework, you're asked to practice skills between sessions, and some people just don't want to put that effort into it. Light box therapy, for example, also requires scheduling and, being good about doing the same thing every day. And, antidepressants are probably the easiest treatment because you just take a pill. And if that's all the amount of effort you want to put into a treatment, then, that's probably the best treatment for you.
Is this something, if you're not living by yourself and maybe you have a spouse or a partner, that you can sort of get buy-in from someone who's near you who, to kind of help hold you accountable, like, hey, I need you to make sure that I'm using my light box every morning. Is that an effective way to deal with some of these issues?
It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think when you're talking about habit change, anytime you're talking about doing something different, it can be very helpful to have buy-in, but can also be helpful to have that accountability. So absolutely.
And there are treatments that sometimes actively include family members for that reason. Because family members can do one of two things. They can enable bad habits or they can help push, the person to do the thing that's going to be most healthy for them.
And Sharon, I do want to talk about some nutritional and lifestyle tips, but first we have another email. Brandon writes, the one panelist noted being active. Can you clarify, does immersing oneself in outdoor activity versus indoor activity have a different long-term benefits? Does learning to appreciate more winter activities alter one's perception of the winter mood?
It doesn't matter if it's outdoor or indoor activity. It's about, doing something, scheduling activities, often scheduling pleasant activities. One of the symptoms of depression is not enjoying things that you used to enjoy. So sometimes it's pushing yourself to do things that you don't feel like doing now, but you used to enjoy. Exercise, but it can be indoor exercise, outdoor exercise. So it's more about being active and scheduling activities than whether it's outdoor or indoor.
And so when I think active, is it necessarily like heart pounding type exercise, or is it just getting up and moving and also creating those positive associations?
It's getting up and doing things. So getting involved in life, basically.
And we know that in the winter months, sometimes there is a decrease in serotonin, sort of the neurotransmitter that it, helps with mood regulation, helps with positive mood. So I think doing any kind of activity, like a physical activity, will increase that serotonin. I like the idea actually of doing something outdoors and sort of maybe having a more positive association with the outdoors, because if you're a runner or a swimmer and you think to yourself, I only like to do those outdoor activities, it might be harder to get excited about the winter months. But I think watching all these winter athletes in the Olympics is making me think, oh, there's a lot of really neat things that you can do in the winter that I wouldn't necessarily think, but that might make the winter more enjoyable. So I can see both ways.
We've talked at one point about creating a WPSU curling team, but it's yet to happen. So along with exercise comes naturally good nutrition. So Sharon, are there any tips you can give to people, likewise with it might be harder to do certain activities in the winter? I would think it might be harder for people when they're thinking, I can't go to my local farmer's market, or there's not an abundance of fresh produce available for me like there might be in the summer. So what are some tips that people can do to still make sure they're eating healthy and getting proper nutrition in the winter months?
Well, I think the important thing is, to look at the overall picture. As Michelle said, scheduling activities, making sure you stay on schedule with your meals, being sure that you're getting up and eating breakfast in the morning. That's very important to provide, energy to get you through the day, and having regular meal times, whether it's 3 meals a day or small meals during the day, whatever really fits your schedule, but making sure that you're not skipping meals as well. Also, the whole idea of just including plenty of plant-based foods, fruits and vegetables. If you can't get fresh fruits and vegetables, use canned, frozen fruits and vegetables as well. You want to continue to eat those types of foods that have plenty of fiber in them. Thinking also about meal times in general. Trying to make those pleasant times while you're eating, kind of turning off the TV and the electronics and all of that kind of thing, and just sitting and enjoying and being mindful about what you're eating, can slow down your pace of eating and really savor what you're eating and get that sense of fullness so that later on you're not overeating or not feeling hungry. There's no one magic food or anything like that. Although some of the research we're seeing now is recommending making sure you're getting plenty of omega-3 fatty acids. And those primarily are in fatty type of fish like salmon, tuna, mackerel, flaxseed, walnuts are high sources of omega-3 fatty acids. And for the most part, we don't really eat a lot of fish, so trying to include that several times a week in your diet would be helpful as well.
What about like an omega-3 supplement?
You could try omega-3 supplements. Anytime you're going to take a supplement, you want to check with your doctor. As a dietitian, I always think it's better to try and get it through food as opposed to supplements, because there's lots of other nutrients and phytonutrients in foods that you're not going to just get in a supplement. So trying as much as you can through foods.
Great. We have another email. Tina writes, winter months make me feel a lot hungrier than usual. I find myself snacking right before going to bed often, which I know isn't a great habit. What are better eating habits to help me get through the winter months when I'm less active? So we touched on that a little. Is there anything more that you'd like to give advice to Tina?
I would say probably one of the things I think I hear people saying is they're craving the carbohydrates. And as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, it tends to be those more simple carbohydrates, higher in sugar. So trying to get the good carbohydrates, the ones that have more fiber in them. If you're snacking, maybe cereals that are higher in fiber, something like oatmeal would be a better choice. And again, thinking about your portions and also just kind of asking yourself, am I really hungry? And if I'm really hungry, okay, I'm going to eat. Or is it just, I'm down or I don't have anything else to do, so I'm going to have something to eat. And if that's the reason, maybe just wait a few minutes and see if that passes.
I would just add something, which is that oftentimes you can develop associations between eating and certain stimuli like reading or watching television. And if you get into the habit of eating while reading or watching television, then just picking up the book or turning on the TV can actually, via classical conditioning, trigger hunger.
Not actual hunger,
Yes,
craving, right?
Yes. So it's also good not to get, if you're trying to sort of fix that, the best way to do it is to actually never eat while you're doing more, eat without doing another activity at the same time.
So be present with your food.
Exactly.
Presence is so important. I think one of the interesting things is people, and even in this discussion, tend to focus a lot on the depressive aspect of seasonal anxiety disorder, but there is actually an anxiety component to this.
Yes. And so in addition to feeling sort of more depressed during the darker or the winter months, or people can either feel just that and then in the summer feel better, or they can cycle between feeling depressed in the winter and anxious in the summer. Or they can just feel anxious and have, difficulty sleeping, have those sorts of symptoms during the summer. So it can take a variety of forms.
I feel like that's something I had never thought about before, is the kind of summer onset
Yeah,
seasonal
exactly.
affective disorder.
Exactly.
One thing I had wanted to ask is if travel can help. Say if you were suffering from seasonal affective disorder, if you go to Bermuda for a week, is that going to help you, or is that sort of a Band-Aid to a bigger problem?
I would say it's probably more of a Band-Aid if you're, it's not going to fix the problem if you're mostly living in an area where you're affected by, dark winter months, for example.
I'd say I'd say the only positive part about it is that it's a nice reminder that, because sometimes people can become very worried or like almost identify with the symptoms that they're experiencing. And I think the only helpful thing about like a remission of those symptoms is that it reminds you that like a lot of this is contextual. Like this is not me. I will not feel like this forever. So even though we would still advise getting treatment for the concerns at hand, it is sort of a nice reminder that, you know, this too shall pass, sort of like that.
If you're just joining us, this is Conversations Live, Seasonal Affective Disorder on WPSU. Our guests tonight are Dr. Michelle Newman, a professor of psychology and psychiatry for Penn State, Dr. Natalie Hernandez de Palma, a psychologist and the assistant director of clinical services at Penn State's Counseling and Psychological Services, and Sharon McDonald, a food and safety and quality educator with Penn State Extension. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. You can also connect by emailing us at connect@wpsu.org. And we do have an email in the queue. We have Rob, who writes, I've heard that serotonin can be boosted by simply increasing your daily vitamin D intake, which the sun provides you. Is that true, or is there more to it? Sharon, do you want to?
Well, with serotonin, vitamin D obviously is related to sunlight, and in a lot of cases, if you do have low levels of vitamin D, a supplement might be helpful. Again, it's not going to solve the problem completely, but it can boost your levels. The other thing with serotonin, tryptophan, which is an amino acid, is really a precursor for synthesis of serotonin. And tryptophan is mainly found in high protein foods, your meats. Of course, we would recommend leaner meats. You know, dairy foods, eggs would also be good sources of tryptophan. So there again, making sure that you're including those protein foods in your diet as well. And interestingly enough, it's, you know, at Thanksgiving time, people will often talk about, you know, the tryptophan and, you know, after eating. In order for the tryptophan to really be better absorbed, you do have to include carbohydrates in your diet. But again, those should be the carbohydrates that are higher in fiber, more complex carbohydrates, whole grains, fruits and vegetables. And including those along with the protein will help the tryptophan to be better used within your body to develop the serotonin. So.
I want to go back briefly to talking about anxiety and how that can be part of seasonal affective disorder, either in the winter or the summer. What are some of the symptoms that people could be on the watch for anxiety to again differentiate sort of the normal worries that you might have every day or in a stressful period to what would actually be considered something that you should be seeking treatment for?
Well, similar to what we said for depression, you know, if it feels like it's interfering with your functioning, and that can include your ability to concentrate. Low concentration is something that can be affected by both anxiety and depression. You know, difficulty falling or staying asleep, for example, not getting good night's sleep can also be affected by anxiety and worry. And, you know, at any point, if you feel like also you're just experiencing chronic, moderate distress for either anxiety or depression, that's also a sign that, you know, maybe you want to seek treatment.
Do you have anything to add?
No,
Okay, we got it covered. I think there's a tendency for people to think of seasonal affective disorder as, I've seen it referred to as lighter major depressive disorder, as kind of a lighter depression, and people aren't really suffering from this. So I think what's problematic about thinking of it in that terms?
Well, seasonal affective disorder can occur along a continuum. So about 15% of the population can have it at a sort of subsyndromal level, you know, non-clinical level. And I think, though, that if you're experiencing clinical levels, then the severity of the symptoms is going to be comparable to any other mental health problem. So it's not lighter in that sense. And even subsyndromal seasonal affective disorder can, if it's affecting you, then, you know, it might be a good idea to seek treatment.
So people need to understand that this is a mental health issue that they
Yes.
should be seasking treatment from. It's not just ignore it until the sun comes back.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Do you have anything else?
No, just agreeing with you.
Okay,
Absolutely.
all right. We do have a phone call. Fred from Bellefonte. Fred?
Hello.
Hello. Do you have a question or comment for our panel?
Well, I want to be happier than what I am. I'm 82 years old. I'm very physically well. I find myself slipping into sleeping a lot more, not being energetic about life the way I used to be. And I resolved to that myself that it's just a function of my age. That's the way it has to be. Genetically, I think I'm very sound. From what I have people live into their 90s, but to think that I'm going to live another 8-10 years being disenchanted disappoints me. The end.
Yeah. Well, let's not the end. Is there any helpful advice we can give Fred, or is that true what he said? He just needs to
No.
resign himself.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I would encourage you to seek treatment. I think that there are a lot of things that can affect mood and outlook, and a lot of the things that we've discussed can help it if it's related to the season. If it's not related to the season, either talk therapy or antidepressants can be very helpful.
And I think, acknowledging that there's something that you want to be different in your life is the exact, perfect first step. Knowing that something doesn't feel right now, and I sort of know what I would like to be different. That's a perfect place to be when you start treatment, because that can put you and your therapist on the sort of path to wellness very quickly.
That actually made me think of some articles I've read about loneliness being a problem, particularly in aging populations. And I'm wondering if there's a correlation too between the winter months, people naturally are out less, they have less contact with one another, and then if there's already maybe a tendency toward a depressive disorder, is that something that can exacerbate it, particularly when it's cold outside?
Definitely. I mean, it's related to activity levels. One of the reasons why you often schedule activities is because it can have you interacting with other people in some capacity, and so being active or seeking other venues for social support can be helpful as well.
What sort of venues might be helpful for people to seek out?
Any sort of group or club, for example, can be highly helpful.
Maybe taking a class?
Yeah.
Okay. That's good.
I don't know if you
know. Oh, we do have another email. Kimberly writes, is seasonal affective disorder hereditary? If there's a history of it in my family, am I at risk?
Yes. Yeah, it's more likely to occur, if you have family members who have it, or parents, for example, close relatives, then you're more likely to have it as well.
And I think being genetically predisposed, we're all genetically predisposed to various things, but I think knowing that actually can empower us to figure out what we'd like to do with that information, because I think being able to identify what you might be on the lookout for can help you get to treatment options quicker.
And speaking of being genetically predisposed, are there people who maybe are more likely, just by nature of who they are, their age, their gender, who are more likely to suffer from seasonal affective disorder?
I mean, for any disorder, that there seems to be various predispositions to develop them, whether it's depression or anxiety, for example. There are greater tendencies, and we don't know exactly why. Some of it can also be environmental or modeling. You see parents behaving in certain ways, and you behave in certain ways. They have, you mimic the outlooks of the people around you, so.
So I guess, are there people who might be, I know I've read that, obviously the farther you are from the equator, we said in the open, the farther or the harsher a winter is. So does the actual conditions that you're living in have an impact on how likely you are?
Yeah, I actually read a study that showed that people who live in very restricted climates, like, where there are months that are dark, for example, tend to be less genetically predisposed to develop seasonal affective disorder. So for some reason, they seem to be, develop over the years some sort of protective factors.
Speaking of going back to lifestyle, and we've talked a little bit about nutrition and activity, and we've talked about kind of the propensity to want to sleep more when it's a little colder out, or maybe just even stay in bed longer. What role does sleep play in mental health in general, but particularly in seasonal affective disorder?
Yeah, I think about sleep as impacting really everything because it's such a huge thing with regard to our wellness. So when I think about seasonal affective disorder, a lot of times we may see insomnia, but we may also see hypersomnia, so sort of sleeping a lot. And often we'll feel like we need to get more and more sleep to really feel rested. Our typical advice is to give really good sleep hygiene tips. And so those are things like, setting a regular bedtime, waking up around the same time, having a pretty cold bedroom as much as possible, because having a lower temp in the room tends to make us sleep more soundly. No distractions, decreasing stimuli before bed. And I tell people, the closer that a screen is to your face, the more stimulating it is. So a cell phone right in front of your face versus a TV across the room, that the cell phone will be very stimulating. That blue light right in your face will sort of decrease that melatonin and wake you right up. And so those are things we advise for really anyone.
And I would also add that, only bed is only for sleep and sex, to be perfectly honest. And everything else you should not do in bed, especially if you have a disposition to have sleep problems. So that's another
no
sleep
checking
hygiene.
those emails at 3 a.m.
No checking emails, no watching television from your bed, not
What about reading?
Some types of reading can actually be good, but calming reading, nothing that's going to activate you.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, we have another email. JB writes, how do you know whether your depression is seasonal affective disorder or depression from current events? And how can one be depressed from all that is happening, not be depressed about all that is happening on the planet? I think that is something probably everyone watching right now might be struggling with in some capacity or another. So
seasonal affective the only difference is that it's cyclical. That seasonal affective disorder tends to be cyclical, meaning that it most commonly comes on during the fall and winter, and then often recedes or morphs into this more anxiety-producing summer seasonal affective disorder. Major depressive disorder, it's the same symptoms, but it can happen anytime. And it can happen for as short as, most of the day, nearly every day for at least 2 weeks, or, chronically longer.
Can it be triggered by current events? I mean, I didn't mean to make light of that, but I just know from empathizing from, you turn on the news or you listen to the radio, it's really hard to not get a little discouraged with the state of the world at some point. So is that something that can actually lead to just beyond a momentary feeling of overwhelming, disappointment to a real issue with depressive disorder?
Especially if you have this disposition to focus on it and be highly reactive to what's going on, and it's hard to separate whether it's a cause or consequence, because when you're depressed or when you're anxious, you're going to tend to be more reactive to those types of events.
Would limiting exposure to things like that might be upsetting maybe be something that would be recommended to someone who's struggling with depressive disorder?
Especially if it's going to affect, your mood throughout the day, yes. And also particularly before you go to bed.
And Natalie, working with students, students obviously probably spend a lot of time with their phones. I'm also thinking about just kind of the natural flow of semesters. When students are dealing with the most stress, I would think it's likely at the time, the time of the school year where also they're struggling with potentially seasonal affective disorder due to the lack of light and the other things we've mentioned. How does that play out in a student population, and there are specifically recommendations you can make for students?
Well, I think if I can connect the two things, the things we were just talking about with regard to social media, I just think very sort of frequently about what are you consuming. And so we're talking about nutrition, but we're also talking about what are you consuming news-wise, what are you consuming, friend-wise, sort of when you're walking around in your daily campus life, what's sort of, coming into your sphere, and sort of how are you tolerating that. So I think if you are predisposed to be anxious or to feel some depressive symptoms, it's even more of a reason to be mindful about what you're letting in. We do notice a really significant increase, though, I will say, in the amount of students that we serve during these winter months. And I think a lot of them may be surprised because they might have moved here from a warmer climate or something like that and think, I didn't expect it to feel this way, when fall was over. But that is something we see quite a bit.
We do have another email. Chris writes, sometimes I feel unmotivated for multiple days during the winter. How bad do the symptoms have to be for it to be diagnosed? At what point should someone call the doctor?
So similar to what I said before, if you're feeling sad or down most of the day, nearly every day for at least 2 weeks at a time, then that's kind of one of the signs that it's more than just, subsyndromal symptoms.
Where are places that people can go if they do feel like they need treatment? Is that something, would someone call their primary care physician first, or would they, if they're a student, they have something like CAPS, or is it just as simple as Googling mental health care providers in your area? How do you get started with that process?
Yeah, any of those things can help. You can talk to your primary care physician. You can look for or get a referral for a mental health specialist.
So something that you touched on was talking about kind of what's coming into your sphere and being affected by people around you, and this sort of goes back to the idea of if you're predisposed and talking about hereditary. I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to imply that in any way a mental health disorder is contagious, but if you're in a family where maybe you are predisposed to suffer from a depressive disorder and someone else in your family is suffering, can that kind of trigger those, a mirrored reaction to that?
It can, but to me that's a sign that perhaps both individuals should seek treatment. It's not about avoiding,
Yeah.
or the idea that it's necessarily contagious. But if you're affected and it's to a degree that it's interfering with your functioning or your sleep, then I think that's a sign that you should seek treatment.
And going back to our discussion about sleep, are there any tools or tricks that people can use to ensure that they're getting better sleep, other than, we talked about keeping the house cooler, which kind of surprises me because I would think that would just make you want to stay in bed longer, and making sure it's not, too cold in the room. But what about something like those, not light lamps, the alarm clocks that get brighter as they move away from the bed?
Those dawn simulators.
Yes, thank you. Are those effective?
Some people have found them to be remarkably effective. So it sort of will simulate the sun coming into your room, that it will be a gradual brightening of a light in your room. And then I don't know of any apps that do it, but I do know that you can buy dawn simulators the same way you can buy a light box. And I do think that really helps with the whole getting out of bed and just feeling a little bit more alert right off the bat.
And I'm also wondering for apps or technology, is there anything from a nutrition standpoint that you've come across, Sharon, that or even old-fashioned pen and paper tools or books that people can use to kind of help them in their quest to eat a little bit better during the winter months?
There's a lot of apps out there that you can use as far as tracking what you're eating, or developing menus on your phone or on your iPad. Also for tracking physical activity as well, even setting reminders. It's time to go to the gym or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of things out there, and many of them are free. I know the myplate.gov has a free tracker on there for both physical activity and eating nutrition. So.
How effective is that be? I would think just to actually see what you're doing. I know if anyone who's ever tried the experience of writing down what you're eating, it's usually a lot more than you think you're eating.
It's very effective, especially for weight loss, for people to record what they're eating. Again, it kind of opens your eyes to, how many calories are in a particular food item. It's helpful as far as portioning on food as well, so that you can see, a plate is not necessarily a serving of what a food is, but it is very helpful. And for weight loss, especially people that do track in that way, lose weight over time, and if they continue to do it, it helps to keep the weight off as well.
Any other apps that you two have come across that are helpful?
There are also cognitive behavioral apps, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
But they do exist.
They exist, yes. That can also help you, sort of focus on some of the skills that you would typically learn in treatment.
What about something, I'm thinking of a mindfulness app that'll pop up on my phone sometimes where I'll just be scrolling through my news feed and it'll just say stop for 15 seconds and just watch this leaf and rain or whatever it is.
Yes, there's a lot of those apps out there. There's Calm and there's Headspace and there's a Zen meditation one. There's an awful lot of them. And I think just that act, though, of sort of looking up as you're going throughout your day, we're always looking down and sort of looking up and looking at what the sky or the clouds are doing or looking at a leaf on a tree. Those things really do help sort of reset you. So I like that they're incorporating them into your phone, too, to just remind you.
Just stop and breathe for 15 seconds.
Yes.
We do have an email. Christine writes, does having indoor plants or aromatherapy play any role in treating symptoms?
I don't know any research on either of those that would show that they're effective, but anything that an individual knows makes them feel better is, can't hurt, basically.
Yeah, I'm thinking if there's maybe an ocean breeze scent and it reminds you of summer.
Right, or just seeing the green around you makes you feel better, I think do it.
Is there any research, I'm curious, on things like air purifiers or things like that might impact mood?
I read something about removing the negative ions, but it's not my area of expertise, so I don't really want to speak to it, but nothing that I'm aware of.
One thing, getting back into the nutrition and the being conscious of what you're doing and also your mood is, I think, a substance we generally might turn to in the winter because it's hot and it's warm is coffee. And as we know, caffeine can have impacts on your sleep and it can also lead to increased anxiety. So I guess are there recommendations around consumption of things with caffeine in them as it relates to your general mood and in particular in the winter?
Well, yeah, when you drink caffeine can affect your sleep. And also being over-caffeinated can overstimulate you and make you more likely to be anxious. So, if you're experiencing heightened anxiety, one fix is, reasonable amounts of caffeine.
Which a fun piece of trivia. I just have to say that in researching this, I wanted to share it. It's recommended that an adult consume no more than 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine in a 3 or 4 hour period. A single tall cup of Starbucks coffee contains 260 milligrams and up to a venti is 480. So I think it's pretty hard to moderate if you're out and about. And do you have anything to add on caffeine, Sharon?
Well, as Michelle said, I mean, caffeine affects everybody a little bit differently. So you really kind of have to, track what you're consuming, and if it is something that is overstimulating you, then start to cut back on it or eliminate it from your diet if you can. But it's coffee, it's tea, it's cola beverages, it's all the fancy coffees out there, it's the energy drinks, it's all those things that that are contributing caffeine. So it's just not about the coffee.
Are there or I was going to say, what are some kind of common hidden things that people wouldn't necessarily think have caffeine that they should maybe be on the lookout for?
I think sometimes with seasonal affective disorder or depression, a lot of times people might have physical symptoms, like they may have some pain, and there's caffeine in some pain relievers. And so things like if you take an Excedrin migraine or if you took even Advil, sometimes there can be hidden caffeine in your pain relievers, so things like that.
It's sneaky. We have an email. Jen writes, is SAD considered a lighter version of major depressive since it is only seasonal? We did kind of touch on that, but if we want to kind of recap that.
Sure. So it isn't considered a lighter version because it tends to recur and because it has the same impact as major depressive disorder.
Gotcha. What advice would you have for someone if they think they might be suffering from seasonal affective disorder, or also if they think someone they know might be suffering from seasonal affective disorder, maybe a roommate or a spouse or a friend?
Get assessed, go to a mental health care specialist and get an assessment is one way. Make a phone call. Sometimes, if you think a loved one has something, I sometimes get phone calls where people will ask me, I know somebody who's experiencing these symptoms. Is that something that a mental health specialist can treat?
And if somebody does get assessed maybe once and their symptoms persist, is this kind of a one-stop, I took care of it and I don't, or is this something that if you get assessed and maybe somebody doesn't meet the criteria at the time but they're still struggling, is there cause to go back?
Yes. I mean, and again, even if you don't meet clinical criteria, if you're struggling and it's affecting your functioning or your level of distress, then that's sufficient to seek treatment.
Sure. Yeah, even if I was feeling really poorly and I didn't actually have the flu, like I didn't, meet the criteria, but I still felt terrible, I would still get the same recommendations like fluid and rest and, don't go to work and things like that. So I think the same is true here, that we would want to treat the symptoms.
We do have another email. Pam writes, are there side effects to using light therapy?
None that I know of.
None that I'm aware of either. I think it's actually one of the safer therapies because it's not as though it's not like a tanning bed or something like that where you have to be worried about that spectrum of light that you're getting, and it's typically for just 20-25 minutes a day.
And are all light boxes created equal? Is there something somebody should look for? I mean, it's not just a bright lamp, am I correct?
It's a bright lamp that mimics sunlight, so it's that bright. But other than that, I think that there are tons out there. I actually saw that Consumer Reports had an issue on light boxes, so that might be a good place to check.
A place to look. We do have a phone call. Carol from Falls Creek. Carol, you're on the air.
I was wondering, all these senior citizens, for the winter, they go down south. Do they all have this thing?
That's a very, very good question.
I think a lot of people enjoy summer months during the wintertime for a variety of reasons, including the fact that they don't have to deal with snow. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it just because they have seasonal affective disorder. As was mentioned earlier, a lot of people can also have subsyndromal symptoms, and a lot of people are affected by restricted light, even if they're not depressed, and that can be sufficient to want to leave and go somewhere sunny.
Yes, I think you said at the start, Natalie, something like 95% of people will have some sort of
And even living in a warmer climate, like if you've ever gone to visit like a Virginia beach or something in February and March, people still act as though it's a very cold time of year, even though for those of us in a really cold climate, we might think, oh, this is lovely, I could go sit out on the beach. So I do think context matters and sort of perspective matters with this.
Does age play a role in seasonal affective disorder?
I guess I would say only to the extent that, if you're older, it's harder to function in winter months because of snow, for example, getting out, or, sensitivity to hot and cold changes. greater difficulty moving in general that can come with age. Those sorts of things make you more disposed to want to not fight it and just kind of sit.
But genetically speaking, is there any correlation between age and seasonal depression, or is it just kind of?
Not that I've seen. The only thing I can imagine is that if you've had sort of a negative cognition about the weather, and that might have persisted over time, that might just get stronger and stronger, that sort of negative association, the more years, the more winters you have to go through. So I can imagine there could be a little bit of conditioning there, but nothing that I've read about from the perspective of what you're talking about.
Is there any particular resources that you can recommend, as we're almost out of time, but resources, either books or articles, podcasts, videos, things people could look at, or if maybe they just want to learn more, they're not at a point where clinically they think they need to see someone, but they just want to learn more about what this is and maybe keep an eye on it either for themselves or a loved one?
You can Google seasonal affective disorder treatment or seasonal affective disorder symptoms, and you can find a lot of websites that are highly informative.
Natalie, do you have any?
One of my favorite books is called Feeling Good, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy, sort of like gold standard book that I think does some really nice beginnings of that kind of treatment, if that might be something individuals are interested in.
By David Burns.
Yes.
And Sharon, any tools or resources you recommend for a quick overview on good nutrition?
I would say to just kind of keep in mind that you want to include plenty of fruits and vegetables of all different colors. Make those kind of half your plate, and then the rest of your plate a lean source of protein and some type of a complex carbohydrate.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to thank our guests tonight, Dr. Michelle Newman, a professor of psychology and psychiatry from Penn State, Dr. Natalie Hernandez de Palma, a psychologist and the Assistant Director of Clinical Services at Penn State's Counseling and Psychological Services, and Sharon McDonald, a food safety and quality educator with Penn State Extension. I'm Lindsay Wissel-Fenton. For all of us here at WPSU, thank you for joining us, and good night.